Hi everyone, I'm here with a true story from our book, Angels and Wonders, True Stories of Heaven and Earth. I think this is the last one I'm going to read for tonight. This quote before it's a hymn. Now think we all are God. Now think we all are God, with hearts and hands and voices, who wondrous things hath done, in whom his world rejoices. And this story is called, Who Wondrous Things Hath Done. Bill Campbell is a member of the Lutheran Church of the Atonement in Barrington, Illinois, and loves the Lord, a friendly and gracious man. He has taught Bible study for years to people of all denominations and has collected many miracle stories, which he shares whenever possible. Bill has lost touch with the missionary who told him the following episodes, so we will call this man Jim Jackson. Jim and his wife Irene, both members of a London-based church, had worked for almost 30 years in Africa. Now they needed a new church building, so they traveled through Kenya and Uganda, visiting outposts and asking for funds. Church members were generous, and the Jacksons were carrying a great deal of cash with them one evening when they set up their tent in the bush. As they built a fire and cooked their evening meal, Jim became apprehensive. There were natives in this area, he knew, and an outlaw branch was unfriendly to Christian missionaries. After supper, Irene fell asleep quickly, but Jim stayed alert, growing more nervous at every rustle. Suddenly, he saw a group of natives on the outskirts of the small clearing. They were tall, ominous. Obviously, they had heard about the money he and Irene were carrying, warlike and holding long spears. The natives moved sleepily toward them. He and Irene would have no chance against this clan. Jim knew. What should they do? Pray. But oddly, when the natives reached the outer edge of Jim's camp, they came to an abrupt halt. Murmuring among themselves, they reversed direction and inexplicably slipped away. Jim was greatly relieved, but puzzled too. Why had the tribe not attacked? He decided to say nothing to Irene about their narrow escape. The following night, at a new campsite, the same thing happened. There were the men, appearing even more aggressive. Lifting their spears, they moved purposely toward Jim, then again stopped and faded away. When the tribe reappeared on a third night, Jim could bear the attention no longer. Get it over with, he shouted to the native in the native language. You've got the spears and you know we've got the money. We are ready to die for the Lord. The leader of the group stepped out of the darkness. We have followed you and tried to close in on you for 3 or 4 nights, he told Jim, but we cannot. Who are these people around you? What people? Jim demanded. You know that my wife and I are alone. An unusual band in white, the chief explained. We have counted 12 of them. They circle your fire and hold hands. They are transparent, yet they will not let us through. Perhaps the chief and his men had been drinking, Jim thought, but he said nothing, and once again the natives retreated. They never returned. God had angels protecting them. Jim and Irene eventually went back to London, then visited the United States to continue fundraising. One night, Jim was invited to speak to a men's group at the Episcopal Church in Long Island, New York. There were only a handful of men there when Jim arrived. A disappointing crowd, but sometimes quality was more important than quantity. Jim gave a talk describing his new church, On impulse, he added an account of his adventure with the natives. The men listened, transfixed. Then one spoke up. "That's an interesting story, Reverend. By any chance, did it happen last July 15th? Jim thought. He knew he hadn't mentioned a date or even a season, but yes, it was July 15th, he said, surprised. "How did you know?" "I had a feeling," the other answered, "because, as you know, we've contributed to your work, and you've always been on our prayer list." Jim looked at the others. An awareness seemed to be dawning on each of them. Their faces bore expressions of wonder. "On the evening of last July 5th, we held our weekly prayer meeting here," the spokesman explained. "During prayer, some of us had a strong sense that you and your wife were in danger." Another nodded. "We hadn't even been thinking of you, but the feeling was very powerful, and it didn't go away. Finally, we stood in a circle, joined hands, and prayed for you." "How many were you?" Jim asked, astonished. But a quick canvass of the room had already provided the count. 12. The first man answered simply. "The same 12 that are here tonight." The same 12 that had spiritually crossed continents, Jim realized, and brought a ring of protection where it was most needed. He would never understand how, but he knew who. On another occasion, Jim was talking to a group of African villagers about Jesus. "The Bible says we can ask for anything in his name, and it will be done," Jim explained. The people listened politely. A few days later, the chief came to Jim. "We have decided to ask your God for something," he said. "That's called prayer," Jim explained. "What would you like to ask?" The chief turned and pointed to a large mountain in the distance. "Whenever we trade with the tribe on the other side," he explained, "we have to climb across that mountain. It's difficult and takes much time. We want your God to eliminate this mountain for us." Jim stared in disbelief, his heart sinking. "I'm sorry I was ever ordained," he told Irene later that night. "Right now I have less faith than that chief does." "Maybe God will move the mountain," Irene smiled. "Stranger things have happened." Jim, however, saw no humor in the situation. He had made a promise to the chief in God's name, using words from God's book. My mouth. Not only would he be a laughingstock when the mountain remained, but the tribe would never believe that Jesus was God's son. That night there was an earthquake in Kenya. The Jacksons watched, trembling as the earth rumbled and groaned. But when the sun rose, they realized that the damage was not as great as they had feared. There was only one major change in the landscape around them. The mountain had split. Like the parting of the Red Sea, there was now a path linking the two sides, a path perfect for two tribes who wished to trade with one another. Jim almost fainted before he got down on his knees. You think God can't move mountains? Here's proof. Good night, guys.